The music conservatory in Moscow stood like a palace, with its tall windows and marble floors that clicked under every footstep. It was 1987, and inside these walls the best young musicians in the Soviet Union practiced day and night, dreaming of stages in Paris, London, and New York. Elena Volkov was one of them. At 23, she already had a reputation. When she walked into a room with her violin case, conversations stopped. Not just because she was beautiful, though she was, with dark hair that fell past her shoulders and eyes that seemed to see right through people. It was more than that. She played the violin like it was part of her body, like the music came from somewhere deep inside her soul. But there was something else about Elena, too. She knew she was good. Maybe she knew it a little too well. Her father conducted the symphony orchestra. Her mother sang opera at the Bolshoi Theater. Her grandfather had been a famous composer. Music was in her blood, and privilege was all she'd ever known. The best teachers, the finest instruments, invitations to perform at important events. Life had been generous to her, and she'd never questioned why. It was a Friday evening in late autumn when everything changed. The students had gathered in the conservatory's grand hall after their classes ended. Someone had brought wine, hidden in teacups because alcohol wasn't officially allowed. Another student had bread and cheese. It wasn't much, but these informal gatherings were what everyone looked forward to all week. The hall was magnificent, even by Moscow standards. A crystal chandelier hung from the ceiling, throwing light across the polished wooden floor. At one end of the room sat an old Steinway piano, its black surface worn from decades of use. The velvet on the bench had faded to a dusty purple, but when someone played it, the sound filled every corner of that massive space. Elena sat on a windowsill laughing with her friends. There were maybe 30 students in the hall, all of them young and talented and full of dreams. Someone was telling a story about a disastrous audition. Someone else was imitating one of the strict professors. The mood was light. That's when her friend Natasha brought up the subject that always came up. "Elena, you're 23 years old. When are you going to get married? Half the men in this building are in love with you." Elena rolled her eyes. "The men in this building are boys. They play music well enough, but they're not interesting." "You're too picky," another friend said. "What are you looking for? A prince?" Elena stood up and walked toward the center of the room. She'd had just enough wine to feel bold, and she loved being the center of attention. She climbed onto the small stage where the piano sat and turned to face everyone. "You want to know what I'm looking for?" she said, her voice carrying across the hall. "Fine, I'll tell you." She gestured dramatically toward the piano. "I'll marry any man who can sit down at this piano right now and play Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2. All of it. From memory. Perfectly." The room went quiet for a moment, then burst into laughter. Everyone knew that piece. It was one of the most difficult, most beautiful piano concertos ever written. Even professional pianists found it challenging. Playing it from memory without any preparation was nearly impossible. "You're joking," someone said. "I'm completely serious," Elena replied, crossing her arms. "Play it perfectly and I'll marry you. That's my offer." It started as a joke, but then someone accepted the challenge. Dmitri, a piano student with more confidence than skill, walked up to the stage. "I'll try," he said, grinning. He sat down and began to play. The opening was passable, but within a minute he stumbled. His fingers couldn't keep up with the complex passages. He laughed, shook his head, and gave up. "Too fast for me," he admitted. Another student tried. Then another. Each one made it a little further than the last, but none of them could complete even the first movement. The piece required not just technical skill, but also memory, stamina, and emotional depth. It was a test of everything a pianist could be. Elena watched with amusement. She was enjoying this, the way you enjoy a game you know you'll win. With each failed attempt, her smile grew wider. She'd set an impossible standard, and she knew it. Anyone else? She called out after the fifth student gave up. "Surely someone in this prestigious conservatory can play one little piano piece." The room had grown quiet. Some people looked uncomfortable now. What had started as playful had turned into something that felt cruel. The failed pianist sat back down, embarrassed. "Well then," Elena said, stepping down from the stage, "I suppose I'll die an old maid." What a tragedy. She picked up her violin case, ready to leave. "May I try?" The voice came from the back of the hall. It was so quiet that at first Elena wasn't sure she'd heard it correctly. She turned around. Standing near the doorway was a man in his mid-40s holding a mop and bucket. He wore the gray uniform of the conservatory's cleaning staff. His face was thin with deep lines around his eyes. His hair was starting to go gray. His hands, even from a distance, looked rough and worn. Elena had seen him before, of course. He cleaned the practice rooms late at night, but she'd never really looked at him. Janitors were invisible to people like her, part of the background like furniture. The room erupted in laughter. Someone whistled. Someone else made a joke Elena didn't quite catch. The tension that had been building broke like a wave, and suddenly everyone was laughing at the absurdity of it. The janitor wanted to play Rachmaninoff. Elena opened her mouth to say something cutting, something that would get another laugh. But then she looked at the man's face. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't trying to be funny. His expression was serious, almost sad, but there was something else there too. A quiet dignity. By all means, she heard herself say, her voice dripping with false sweetness. She gestured toward the piano with an exaggerated bow. Please, entertain us. The janitor set down his cleaning supplies carefully as if they were precious. He walked to the stage slowly, not meeting anyone's eyes. His shoes made soft sounds on the wooden floor. When he reached the piano, he stood there for a moment, just looking at it. His hand reached out and touched the surface gently, the way you might touch something you loved. Then he sat down. The laughter in the room was dying down, but there were still scattered whispers and giggles. Elena stood with her arms crossed, waiting for this to be over so she could leave. She felt vaguely guilty about humiliating the man, but not enough to stop it. The janitor adjusted the bench. His hands hovered over the keys. Elena noticed they were shaking slightly. He took a deep breath, closed his eyes for just a second, and then placed his fingers on the ivory keys. He began to play. The first few notes were soft, tentative. Elena was already forming a diplomatic sentence in her mind about how everyone had tried their best. But then something happened. The tentative notes grew stronger. The janitor's hands began to move with increasing confidence, dancing across the keys with a precision that seemed impossible. Within seconds, the room fell completely silent. This wasn't just playing. This was something else entirely. The music filled the hall like water filling a glass, reaching every corner, every shadow. And it wasn't just technically perfect. There was emotion in it, a depth of feeling that made Elena's chest tighten. She stood frozen, unable to move, unable to look away. Around her, she could sense the same shock rippling through the crowd. No one was laughing now. No one was whispering. They were all listening, caught in the spell of something they hadn't expected, something they couldn't explain. The janitor played on, his eyes closed, lost somewhere in the music. And for the first time in her privileged life, Elena realized she had made a terrible mistake. The janitor's hands moved across the piano keys like they belonged there. Not carefully, not hesitantly, but with the kind of natural grace that comes from years of practice, the kind that can't be faked. Elena felt her throat go dry. She'd heard this piece performed by professionals at concert halls. She'd heard recordings by famous pianists whose names everyone knew. But standing here in this dusty hall watching a man in a janitor's uniform play, she was hearing something different. Something raw and honest that made her heart beat faster. The first movement of the concerto was building now, growing in intensity. The janitor's whole body moved with the music. His shoulders swayed slightly. His head tilted as if he was listening to something beyond the notes themselves. And his hands, those rough, calloused hands that pushed a mop every night, they were creating something beautiful. Around Elena, students stood with their mouths open. Dmitri, who'd failed to play 3 minutes earlier, had tears running down his face. Natasha gripped the back of a chair so hard her knuckles were white. Even Professor Kozlov, the elderly music theory teacher who'd been passing by the hall, stood in the doorway completely still, hardly breathing. The music swelled and fell, like waves on a shore. There were passages so technically difficult that Elena had heard professionals stumble over them. The janitor played them flawlessly, but it wasn't just the technical perfection that shook everyone in that room. It was the emotion. You could hear longing in those notes, loss, grief. And underneath it all, something that sounded like hope that had almost, but not quite, given up. Elena realized she was holding her breath. Her chest felt tight and her eyes were stinging. She blinked hard, confused by her own reaction. This was just a piano concerto. She'd heard it 100 times. Why did it feel like this man was reaching into her chest and squeezing her heart? The first movement ended. In a normal performance, there would be applause here. A pause before continuing. But the janitor didn't stop. His hands kept moving, flowing seamlessly into the second movement. The slow, achingly beautiful section that always reminded Elena of a lullaby for something lost. This movement was softer, more intimate. It felt like the janitor was playing just for himself now, like he'd forgotten there was anyone else in the room. His eyes were still closed. His face had changed. The lines around his mouth had softened. He looked younger somehow, or maybe just less burdened. Elena found herself thinking about her challenge. "Play and I'll marry you," she'd said, laughing. It had been a joke, a game. She'd never imagined anyone would actually be able to do it, let alone someone like him, someone she'd never noticed, never considered as a real person with a story and a life. She felt ashamed suddenly, deeply ashamed. All those men she'd watched fail and laughed at, they were her classmates, her equals, but she'd humiliated them for entertainment. And this man, this janitor whose name she didn't even know, she'd invited him to fail in front of everyone because she thought it would be funny. Except he wasn't failing. He was showing all of them what real mastery looked like. The second movement ended and still the janitor played on. The third movement began, faster now, more aggressive. His hands flew across the keys in passages that seemed impossible. The music built and built, climbing higher and higher, until it felt like the ceiling of the grand hall might crack open from the force of it. Elena's violin teacher had once told her that true artistry wasn't about playing notes correctly. It was about making the listener feel something they didn't expect to feel. It was about truth. Standing here now, Elena understood what he'd meant. This performance was stripping away every defense she had. It was showing her something about herself she didn't want to see. The music reached its final climax. The janitor's hand struck the keys with power that seemed impossible from such a thin frame. The sound filled every corner of the hall, echoing off the walls and the high ceiling. And then, after one final, triumphant chord, silence. Complete. Absolute silence. The janitor's hands rested on the keys for a moment. His shoulders rose and fell with deep breaths. Slowly he opened his eyes and looked down at his hands as if surprised to find them there. Then he stood up carefully, adjusted the bench back to where it had been, and turned to face the room. His face was calm, but Elena could see wetness on his cheeks. He'd been crying while he played, she realized. The tears had fallen without him seeming to notice. For 5 long seconds, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. It was as if everyone was afraid that making a sound would break whatever spell had been cast. Then someone started clapping. Elena never found out who it was. Within a second, the entire room erupted into applause that was almost violent in its intensity. Students were shouting. Some were crying. Professor Kozlov was nodding his head over and over, his old hands clapping together. The janitor stood on the stage looking uncomfortable with the attention. He gave a small nod, the kind of polite acknowledgement you might give when someone held a door open for you. Then he stepped down from the stage and walked toward his mop and bucket. "Wait." Elena's voice came out strangled and strange. She cleared her throat and tried again, louder this time. "Wait, please." The janitor stopped but didn't turn around. His shoulders tensed. Elena walked toward him, her legs feeling shaky. The applause was dying down now, and everyone was watching her. She reached the janitor and moved around to face him. Up close, she could see his eyes were gray like winter sky. There were deep lines around them, the kind that come from squinting at small print or crying in private. "Who are you?" she asked. Her voice cracked on the last word. The janitor looked at her for a long moment. "Nobody," he said quietly. "I'm nobody." "That's not true," Elena said. "Nobody plays like that." "Where did you learn?" "It doesn't matter." He started to turn away again. "It matters to me." Elena reached out and touched his arm. He flinched and she pulled her hand back quickly. "Please, I need to know. You just played one of the most difficult pieces in the classical repertoire from memory. Perfectly, with more emotion than I've heard in any concert hall. Who taught you?" The janitor looked past her at all the students watching. His jaw tightened. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I taught myself mostly a long time ago." "Where?" "Here," he said simply. "In this building. I was a student here once. Before everything changed." Elena felt like the floor had tilted beneath her feet. "You were a student here?" At the conservatory? He nodded once, a short, sharp movement. Long before your time. 25 years ago. Maybe 30. I don't count anymore. What happened? The question came from Professor Kozlov, who had moved closer to listen. His old face was creased with concern. The janitor's eyes moved to the professor and something flickered there. Recognition, maybe, or memory. You don't remember me, do you, Professor? I was in your harmony class in 1957. I sat in the back row by the window. You once told me I had promise. Professor Kozlov's face went pale. His mouth opened and closed several times before words came out. Victor? Little Victor Petrov? But you disappeared. We heard your family had. He trailed off, unable to finish. My family had problems, Victor said flatly. Political problems. The kind that made us disappear, yes. From the conservatory. From the concert halls. From everything. He picked up his mop and bucket. Now if you'll excuse me, I have floors to clean. Building doesn't care about politics or music. It just needs someone to keep it clean. Victor, wait, Elena called. But he was already walking away, his footsteps echoing in the now silent hall. She stood there watching him go, her mind racing. A student. He'd been a student here. Talented enough to be accepted to the most prestigious music school in the Soviet Union. And then what? His family had been accused of something and he'd lost everything. Lost his future. Lost his music. Lost his name. And now he cleaned the floors where he once studied. Elena looked down at her own hands, soft and uncalloused. Hands that had never held a mop. Hands that had been given private lessons since she was 4 years old. Hands that had been promised a brilliant future before she could even walk. She'd made a joke about marriage. She'd turned someone's talent into a party game. And in doing so, she'd accidentally uncovered something that made her comfortable world feel small and shallow. Natasha touched her arm gently. Elena, are you okay? You look pale. Elena shook her head slowly. She wasn't okay. She didn't think she'd be okay for a long time. Because in those 20 minutes of music, Victor Petrov had shown her what it meant to lose everything and still have something left. Still have the music. And she had no idea what to do with that knowledge. She picked up her violin case and walked out of the hall without saying goodbye to anyone. Behind her, the conversation started up again. Everyone talking at once about what they'd just witnessed. But Elena wasn't listening anymore. She was thinking about rough hands on piano keys, about music that came from loss instead of privilege, about a promise she'd made as a joke that suddenly didn't feel funny at all. Elena couldn't sleep that night. She lay in her bed staring at the ceiling of her small apartment, replaying those 20 minutes over and over in her mind, the way Victor's hands had moved, the tears on his face. The way he'd said, I'm nobody, like he actually believed it. The next morning, she arrived at the conservatory 2 hours early. She told herself she had practicing to do, but that was a lie. She was looking for him. She found him in the east wing, mopping the floor of practice room 7. He worked slowly, methodically, his movements efficient but not rushed. When he saw her standing in the doorway, he stopped and leaned on his mop, waiting. Can I ask you something? Elena said. Victor looked at her for a long moment, then nodded once. Why did you stop playing? After you left here, I mean. Why give up music completely? Something flashed across his face. Pain maybe, or anger. I didn't give it up, he said quietly. It was taken from me. There's a difference. But you still know how to play. You could have found a way, played in churches or taught private lessons or... You don't understand how it worked back then, Victor interrupted. His voice was gentle but firm. When your family is marked, you're marked too. Nobody wants to hire someone whose father was arrested for writing the wrong poems. Nobody wants to risk their own future by helping you. The conservatory expelled me overnight. My name was removed from all records. It was like I'd never existed here at all. Elena felt her cheeks burn. I'm sorry. I didn't mean... You didn't mean anything, Victor said, not unkindly. You're young. You weren't even born when these things happened. How could you understand? He went back to mopping, the mop making wet sounds against the floor. Elena stood there awkwardly, not sure what to say next. Finally, she asked, Do you still play? Ever? Victor stopped mopping again. He looked at her with those gray eyes that seemed much older than his face. Yes, he admitted. Late at night when everyone's gone home. There's a practice room on the third floor with a broken lock. Nobody ever checks it. I go there sometimes. How often? Every night. The answer surprised her. Every single night for how many years? 10, 20? Playing alone in an empty room with no audience, no applause, no recognition. Just the music and the silence. Can I come listen? The words came out before Elena had fully formed the thought. Victor looked startled. Why would you want to do that? Because what I heard yesterday was the most beautiful playing I've ever experienced. And because she hesitated, trying to find the right words. Because I think I need to understand something. Understand what? Why I've been playing music all these years. What it's really for. Victor studied her face for a long moment. Then he sighed. Room 314, around midnight. The night guard doesn't come by until 2. But if we're caught, I lose my job. You understand that? Elena nodded. I understand. That night, Elena told her roommate she was going to the conservatory to practice. It wasn't unusual. Many students worked late, but her hands were shaking as she climbed the stairs to the third floor at 11:45. Room 314 was at the end of a long hallway. The door was slightly open and she could see light coming from inside. She pushed it open carefully. Victor sat at an old upright piano, not as grand as the Steinway in the hall, but well-maintained. He was playing something soft and melancholy that Elena didn't recognize. When he heard the door, he stopped and turned. You came, he said, sounding genuinely surprised. I said I would. He nodded and gestured to a chair in the corner. Sit, but don't talk while I play. I need to concentrate. Elena sat and watched as Victor turned back to the piano. He didn't start right away. Instead, he sat there with his hands hovering over the keys like he was gathering himself. Then he began. He played for 2 hours straight. Chopin nocturnes that made Elena want to cry. Bach preludes that felt like mathematics made into emotion. Beethoven sonatas that shook with anger and hope. He played pieces she knew and pieces she'd never heard. And between each one, there was just a moment of silence before his hands found the next beginning. Elena forgot to breathe sometimes. She'd been playing violin since she was 4 years old, had performed in competitions and concerts, had received standing ovations. But sitting in that small practice room listening to a janitor play piano at midnight, she realized she'd never really understood what music was for. She'd thought it was about perfection, about impressing people, about winning. But Victor wasn't trying to impress anyone. He was playing because he had to, because the music was still inside him after all these years, demanding to come out, because it was the one thing nobody had been able to take from him completely. When he finally stopped, Elena's face was wet with tears. She hadn't noticed crying. Victor turned to look at her. Are you all right? She nodded, not trusting her voice. After a moment, she managed to ask, What happened to your father? Your family. Victor was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he said, My father was a poet, not a famous one. He wrote about ordinary things, trees, bread, his children's laughter. But he wrote one poem that mentioned bread lines. Just mentioned them, nothing more. Someone reported him, called it anti-Soviet propaganda. He paused. They arrested him in 1958, sent him to a labor camp in Siberia. He died there 2 years later. Pneumonia, they said. And your mother? She worked in a factory after that. Died young. Tired, I think. Just too tired to keep going. Victor ran his hand across the piano keys without pressing them down. I had a younger sister. She married a man from another city, changed her name. I haven't seen her in 15 years. She wanted to forget we ever existed. I don't blame her. Elena wiped her eyes. I'm so sorry. Everyone's sorry, Victor said without bitterness. Sorry doesn't change anything. Time moves forward. Life continues. You learn to carry your losses with you. But the music, Elena said. You kept the music. The music kept me, Victor corrected. There were times when it was all I had. Times when I wanted to give up completely. But I'd think about this building, these pianos, the sound of a properly played crescendo, and I'd keep going one more day. Elena stood up and walked closer to the piano. Will you teach me? Victor looked up at her, confused. Teach you what? You're already a brilliant violinist. Everyone says so. Teach me what you know. Not technique. Not theory. The other thing. The thing that makes your playing sound the way it sounds. I don't know if that can be taught, Victor said slowly. Then let me just come here and listen. Every night, please. Victor studied her face, searching for something. Whatever he saw there must have satisfied him because he finally nodded. All right. But the same rules apply. Midnight, room 314. And if anyone asks, you don't know me. Deal, Elena said. She started coming every night. At first, she just listened while Victor played. But after a week, he asked her to bring her violin. They started playing together, piano and violin, improvising duets late into the night when the conservatory was empty and silent. Something changed in Elena during those weeks. The arrogance that had made her issue that cruel challenge started to fade. She began to see her own privilege clearly for the first time. The opportunities she'd been handed without question. The doors that had opened for her simply because of her last name. The way she'd walked through life expecting the world to accommodate her. Victor never lectured her. He never pointed out her advantages or made her feel guilty. But his mere presence was a lesson. Here was someone with more natural talent than anyone she'd ever met. Someone who should have been performing on the world's greatest stages. Instead, he pushed a mop and played piano in secret at midnight, and he did it without becoming bitter. Without hating the students who'd been given what he'd lost. Without giving up the one thing that made him feel alive. One night, about a month after they'd started their midnight sessions, Elena asked him, "Do you ever wish things had been different? That your father hadn't written that poem? That you could have had the career you deserved?" Victor thought about it for a long time. "Of course I wish things had been different," he finally said. "But wishing doesn't change the past. And honestly, I don't know who I would have become if everything had been easy. Maybe someone shallow. Maybe someone who played technically perfect but emotionally empty music." He smiled slightly. "Suffering isn't good, Elena. Don't romanticize it. But it does teach you what matters." Elena realized she was falling in love, not with the idea of Victor, not with the romance of a tragic figure, but with the man himself. With his quietness, his dignity, his refusal to let his losses destroy him, his hands that pushed a mop all day and created beauty all night. It terrified her. He was old enough to be her father. He had nothing, no status, no money, no future. Her family would be horrified. Her friends would think she'd lost her mind. The conservatory would likely expel her if they found out. But sitting in that practice room at 1 a.m, listening to Victor play Schubert, Elena realized she didn't care about any of that anymore. She'd made a promise. "Play and I'll marry you." She'd meant it as a joke. But Victor had played, and Elena was beginning to understand that some promises, even the ones made carelessly, had a way of demanding to be kept. The rumors started about 6 weeks after that night in the Grand Hall. At first they were whispers. Elena spent too much time at the conservatory. Someone had seen her in the East Wing talking to the janitor. She seemed different lately, distracted during rehearsals. Then the whispers got louder. Natasha confronted her one afternoon in the practice room. "People are talking, Elena. They're saying you're involved with that janitor. With Victor." Elena kept rousing on her violin bow, not looking up. "Let them talk. Are you?" Natasha's voice was sharp with concern. "Because if you are, you need to stop. This could destroy everything you've worked for." "What exactly have I worked for?" Elena set down her bow and met her friend's eyes. "A career playing music I don't feel. Impressing people I don't respect. Marrying someone appropriate who bores me to tears. You're being ridiculous. This isn't about feelings. This is about your future. Your family. Do you know what your mother will do when she finds out?" Elena knew exactly what her mother would do, and she was right. 3 days later, her mother arrived at the conservatory unannounced, her face tight with barely controlled fury. They sat in a small cafe across the street. Her mother ordered tea she didn't drink and stared at Elena like she was looking at a stranger. "Is it true?" her mother asked quietly. Each word was carefully controlled. "Are you spending time with the janitor?" "His name is Victor," Elena said. "Victor Petrov." "And yes." Her mother closed her eyes briefly like she was in pain. "Elena, do you understand what you're doing? This man is nobody. He cleans floors. He has no education, no prospects, no future. He was a student here," Elena said, 30 years ago, before his family was destroyed for political reasons that had nothing to do with him. "He has more education than most of my professors and more talent than anyone I've ever met. That's not how the world works, and you know it." Her mother leaned forward. "His past doesn't matter. What matters is what he is now, And what he is now is completely inappropriate for someone in your position. My position, Elena repeated. You mean my privilege. Call it what you want. You have opportunities that thousands of musicians would kill for. The Bolshoi Orchestra is interested in you. You have auditions lined up in 3 cities. Directors are asking about you specifically. And you're going to throw all of that away for what? An old janitor with a tragic story? The words stung because they were designed to. Elena felt her cheeks burn. He's not old. He's 47. He's 24 years older than you. Elena, please. Her mother's voice softened slightly. I know you think you're in love. I know this seems romantic and noble. But love isn't enough. You'll resent him eventually. You'll miss the life you could have had. And he'll know it. Is that fair to him? Is that fair to either of you? Elena had no answer for that. She'd been asking herself the same questions every night. Her mother stood up. The conservatory director wants to see you tomorrow morning. He's received complaints. From other parents. From professors. They're saying you're a distraction. That your behavior is inappropriate. She picked up her purse. Please think carefully about what you're going to lose. That night, Elena didn't go to room 314. She stayed in her apartment, lying on her bed, staring at the water stain on the ceiling. Maybe her mother was right. Maybe this was just a fantasy, a rebellion against her comfortable life. Maybe she was being selfish, dragging Victor into something that would hurt both of them. But then she thought about the music, the way it sounded when they played together, the way Victor's face changed when he was lost in a piece, the conversations they had about composers and technique and the purpose of art, the way he listened when she talked, really listened, like her words mattered. She thought about all the appropriate men her mother wanted her to marry, men who saw her as an accessory, a pretty violinist to show off at parties, men who talked about music like it was a business, a career ladder to climb, men who'd never known loss or pain or what it meant to lose everything and keep going. At 11:30, Elena grabbed her violin and left her apartment. Victor was already in room 314 when she arrived, but he wasn't playing. He sat on the piano bench with his hands in his lap, staring at nothing. I didn't think you'd come, he said without looking up. Why not? I heard your mother was here today. I heard the director wants to see you. He finally turned to face her. Elena, I need to say something. This needs to stop. Elena felt her stomach drop. What? Us? These meetings? All of it. Victor stood up, his movement stiff. I've been selfish. I let this continue because I was lonely, because it felt good to have someone care about my music again. But I'm ruining your life. You're not ruining anything. Yes, I am. His voice was firm now. Do you know what people are saying about you? About us? You're going to lose your place here. Your family is going to disown you. You have this incredible future ahead of you, and I'm destroying it. That's not true. It is true. Victor walked to the window and looked out at the dark campus. I'm 47 years old. I push a mop for a living. I have nothing to offer you except midnight piano sessions in a room with a broken lock. What kind of future is that? Elena set down her violin case carefully. Do you want me to leave? Is that what you're saying? Victor was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was barely audible. No, that's the problem. I don't want you to leave. I want you to stay here every night forever. I want to hear you play and talk with you and... He stopped. But what I want doesn't matter. What matters is what's best for you. Don't I get to decide that? You're 23 years old. You don't know what you're deciding. Elena felt anger flash through her. I'm not a child, Victor. Stop treating me like one. Then stop acting like one. He turned to face her and his eyes were hard. This isn't a fairy tale. There's no happy ending here. I'm not a prince in disguise. I'm a janitor who will always be a janitor. You're a brilliant musician from a good family with the world waiting for you. We don't make sense. Since when does love make sense? The word hung in the air between them. Elena hadn't meant to say it out loud, but there it was. Love. She watched Victor's face change, saw something break open in his expression. Don't, he said quietly. Please don't say that. Why not? It's true. Because it makes this harder. Victor sat back down on the piano bench heavily, like his legs wouldn't hold him anymore. Because I feel the same way, and I know it's wrong, and I don't know what to do about it. Elena crossed the room and sat beside him on the bench. Then let's figure it out together. There's nothing to figure out. The math is simple. You plus me equals you losing everything. Maybe everything I have isn't worth keeping. Victor looked at her like she'd said something in a foreign language. How can you say that? You have talent, education, opportunities. I have privilege, Elena interrupted. That's all it is. I was born lucky, born into the right family, with the right connections at the right time. But what have I actually done with it? Made jokes at other people's expense? Played music without feeling it? Coasted on my last name? She took his hand. His palm was rough, calloused from years of physical work. You taught me something these past few months. You taught me what music is actually for. It's not for impressing people or winning competitions or building a career. It's for surviving. For holding on to something beautiful when everything else is ugly. For remembering you're human when the world tries to make you forget. Victor's eyes were wet. That's very poetic, but it doesn't change reality. Then maybe reality needs to change. The meeting with the conservatory director the next morning was exactly as bad as Elena expected. He sat behind his large desk, his fingers steepled, his face grave. Your behavior is causing problems, he said without preamble. Parents are concerned. Professors are distracted. The reputation of this institution is being questioned. Because I'm friends with a janitor? Elena kept her voice level. Because you're conducting an inappropriate relationship with an employee. An older man with a questionable background. He was a student here. You expelled him for his father's crimes. The director's face hardened. That was a different time, different circumstances. What matters is now. And right now you need to make a choice. End this relationship or leave the conservatory. Elena had thought about this moment all night. She'd imagined different ways it might go, different things she might say. But sitting there in that office looking at this man who'd never struggled a day in his life, never lost anything, never had to choose between safety and truth, she found she had only one response. I'll leave, she said. The director looked genuinely shocked. Elena, be reasonable. Think about what you're giving up. I am thinking about it. Elena stood up. I'm thinking about it clearly for the first time in my life. She walked out of his office, down the marble stairs, through the grand hall where Victor had played that night 2 months ago. She felt lighter somehow, like she'd been carrying something heavy without realizing it and had finally set it down. She found Victor in the East Wing, mopping the same floor he'd been mopping the first time she really talked to him. I quit, she told him. He stopped mopping. What? The conservatory. I just quit. Well, technically they expelled me, but I quit first. Victor's face went pale. Elena, no. No, you didn't. Tell me you didn't. I did. And I'm not sorry. But your future. My future is mine to decide. Elena took the mop from his hands and set it against the wall. You once told me that suffering teaches you what matters. Well, I'm not suffering, but I'm finally learning. And what matters isn't the conservatory or my mother's approval or the Bolshoi orchestra. What matters is this, us, the music we make together, the person I'm becoming when I'm with you. Victor stood there, frozen, like he couldn't process what she was saying. You're insane, he finally whispered. Probably, Elena agreed, but I made you a promise. Play and I'll marry you. You played, so marry me. That was a joke. Not anymore. Victor looked at her for a long moment. Then to her surprise, he started to laugh. Not a bitter laugh, but something genuine and warm and almost hopeful. You're completely insane, he said again. Your family will disown you. You'll have no money, no career, no support. I'll have you. And I'll have music. That's enough. It's not enough. It's never enough. Then let's find out together. Elena reached for his hand. I'm not saying it'll be easy. I'm not saying we won't struggle. But I'm saying I'd rather struggle with you than succeed without you. Victor pulled her close, and for the first time, he let himself hope. Let himself believe that maybe, just maybe, broken things could be put back together in new ways. That maybe love wasn't about making sense. That maybe the best things in life were the ones you had to fight for. Okay, he whispered into her hair. Okay. Elena's mother didn't speak to her for 3 months. Her father called once, his voice tired and disappointed, and asked if she'd come to her senses yet. When she said no, he hung up. Her brother sent a letter saying she'd embarrassed the family, and he couldn't understand how she could be so selfish. The wedding was held on a cold Tuesday morning in March at a government office that smelled like old paper and floor polish. No family came, no friends from the conservatory, just Victor and Elena, and 2 witnesses they'd pulled in from the hallway, a woman who worked in records and a man waiting to register his new apartment. Elena wore a simple blue dress she'd bought from a second-hand shop. Victor wore his only suit, which was too big in the shoulders and shiny at the elbows from age. The official who married them looked bored and rushed through the ceremony in under 5 minutes. There was no music, no flowers, no celebration. They signed the papers with a pen that kept skipping. When it was done, the official stamped their marriage certificate with a loud thunk and told them they could go. Outside, snow was starting to fall. Victor looked at Elena with something close to panic in his eyes. "What have we done?" he asked. Elena took his hand. "Something terrifying and maybe stupid and probably beautiful. Come on, let's go home." Home was Victor's small apartment in a building where the heat barely worked and the hallway always smelled like cabbage. It was one room with a tiny kitchen in the corner, a bathroom the size of a closet, and a window that looked out at another gray building exactly like theirs. Victor had lived there for 15 years. Now it would be theirs together. Elena had brought 2 suitcases. Everything she owned fit into 2 suitcases. It was strange how little space a life took up when you stripped away everything that didn't matter. That first week was hard. Harder than Elena had imagined. She'd never washed dishes by hand before. Never hung laundry on a line stretched across a room. Never counted kopecks to make sure they had enough for bread and tea. Victor worked his night shifts at the conservatory, and Elena looked for work during the day. But nobody wanted to hire the girl who'd thrown away her future for a janitor. The music school said they had no positions. Private families didn't trust her to teach their children. Even restaurants turned her away when she applied to wait tables. By the end of that first month, Elena understood what real poverty felt like. Not the kind she'd read about in books, but the kind that lived in your stomach and made you walk past bakeries without looking in the windows because the smell of fresh bread was too painful. One night, Victor came home from work and found her crying at the small table. Their last bit of money was gone. She'd spent it on coal for heating because the apartment was so cold she could see her breath. He sat down beside her and didn't say anything for a long time. Then he pulled out a small bundle wrapped in newspaper. Inside were 2 potatoes, half a loaf of black bread, and a piece of cheese the size of his thumb. "Professor Kozlov," Victor explained quietly. "He found me at work tonight. Said he happened to have extra and thought we might want it. He knows it's not charity because he's repaying a debt from 30 years ago, when I helped him with something. His words, not mine." Elena looked at the food and started crying harder. Not from sadness now, but from the kindness of it. From the understanding that they weren't completely alone. They ate slowly that night, making the meal last as long as possible, talking about nothing important. And somehow, sitting in that tiny apartment eating bread and potatoes, Elena felt happier than she'd ever felt at any formal dinner in her parents' house. 2 months after the wedding, Professor Kozlov came to their apartment himself. He looked around at the cramped space, at the thin walls and the single hot plate they cooked on, and his old eyes were sad. "I have a proposition," he said. "There's a community center in the South District. They want to start a music program for children from working families, children whose parents can't afford private lessons. They need teachers." He looked at Elena. "They need a violin teacher. It doesn't pay much." "But it pays." Elena felt her throat tighten. "Why would you do this for me? After everything?" "Because I remember a young man who had more talent than anyone I'd ever taught, and I did nothing when they destroyed him." Professor Kozlov glanced at Victor. "I've regretted that silence for 30 years. I can't fix the past. But maybe I can do something now." Elena took the job. The community center was in a poor neighborhood where buildings leaned against each other like tired old men. The practice room had water stains on the ceiling and windows that didn't close properly. The children who came for lessons had rough hands and worn clothes and eyes that were too serious for their ages, but they wanted to learn. They practiced on borrowed instruments. They showed up even when it was cold and they were tired from helping their parents. And slowly, Elena fell in love with teaching in a way she never expected. There was Irina, 8 years old, whose father worked in a factory and who cried the first time she made a pure note on the violin. There was Mikhail, 12, who was too big for his instrument but played with such fierce concentration that Elena sometimes had to look away. There was little Anastasia, 6, who couldn't reach all the positions yet but sang while she played, her voice bright and fearless. Elena taught them technique, yes. But she also taught them what Victor had taught her, that music wasn't about perfection. It was about truth, about expressing something that couldn't be said with words, about holding on to beauty when the world was hard. In the evenings, she and Victor still played together in their apartment. The neighbors complained sometimes about the noise, but mostly they'd gotten used to it. Some nights, people would gather in the hallway outside their door, sitting on the stairs to listen. Victor would play piano pieces on the old keyboard they'd found at a street market, and Elena would play her violin, and for those moments, the shabby building became a concert hall. 3 years passed this way. Then 4, then 5. The Soviet Union was changing. Glasnost brought new freedoms, new possibilities. Old sins were being examined. Political prisoners were being released. Names were being cleared. One day a letter came. It was from the government, official-looking and frightening. Victor's hands shook as he opened it. Elena stood beside him, her heart pounding. The letter said that Viktor Petrov's family had been wrongly persecuted. His father's conviction had been overturned posthumously. The family name was being officially rehabilitated. Victor was entitled to compensation and restoration of his rights. There was more. The conservatory wanted to offer him a position. Not as a janitor, as a teacher, piano instructor, if he wanted it. Victor read the letter 3 times without speaking. Then he set it down carefully on the table and walked to the window. Elena watched his shoulders shake and realized he was crying. She went to him and wrapped her arms around him from behind. They stood like that for a long time, watching the sunset over their neighborhood with its gray buildings and tired people. "Do you want to take it?" she asked finally. "The teaching position?" Victor was quiet for a moment. "I don't know," he said honestly. "That place took everything from me once. I'm not sure I can go back. You don't have to decide today." "No," he agreed. "Not today." In the end, Victor did go back to the conservatory, but not as a full-time teacher. He agreed to give master classes once a week, teaching advanced students about interpretation and emotion in music. The rest of his time he spent volunteering at Elena's community center, teaching piano to children who couldn't afford lessons anywhere else. He said that teaching privileged students 1 day a week reminded him what talent looked like. But teaching struggling children the rest of the time reminded him what mattered. Elena's family eventually came around. Her mother showed up at the apartment one day, 5 years after the wedding, looking older and more uncertain than Elena remembered. She didn't apologize, but she asked if she could come to one of Elena's student concerts. And when she heard those children play, saw how they looked at Elena with admiration and trust, something shifted in her face. "You were right," she said quietly afterward, "about what music is for. Elena never became famous, never played at the Bolshoi, never toured internationally or recorded albums, but her students went on to do those things. 3 of them won scholarships to the conservatory. 1 became principal violinist in an orchestra. Another opened her own music school for underprivileged children, and every night, Elena and Victor still played together in their apartment that they never moved out of, even after they could afford something better. The neighbors still gathered on the stairs to listen, and sometimes late at night when the music swelled and filled the building, you could feel something magical happening. It wasn't the life Elena had been promised. It wasn't the life anyone expected. But it was real. It was honest. It was built on love and sacrifice and the understanding that the best things in life are the ones you choose, not the ones you're given. Years later, Elena would tell the story to her students. About the night she made a careless promise. About a janitor who sat down at a piano and played something so beautiful it changed everything. About the choice she made and why she never regretted it. "I said I'd marry the man who could play that piece," she'd tell them, "and I did." But the real truth is that night, Victor played more than Rachmaninoff. He played a question. And the question was, what matters more, the life you're supposed to have or the life you choose to live? Elena chose. And in choosing, she found something worth more than fame or fortune or her family's approval. She found purpose. She found love. She found herself. On the evening of their 20th wedding anniversary, Victor surprised her by renting the conservatory's grand hall for 1 hour. The same hall where he'd played that night long ago. He sat at the same Steinway piano, older now, both of them with gray in their hair and lines around their eyes.